Hope you enjoy the next 55 minutes. Because what I'm going to share with you, I enjoy too. And I'll tell you where it comes from so you know what you're at. In England and Wales, we have been worrying and praying and working around how to involve young people in the church. And we've been doing that for a long time. But one of the things, about 5 years ago, somebody came up to us at the end of the session and said, Dave, it's really good that these things are happening and you've got these resources, and thank you that these things are being promoted in the church. But what about us? And I said, what do you mean, what about us? And this guy was, he was explaining to me that his kids had just left home. He was in his mid-50s, and he was saying, you know, there's a danger that we get forgotten. All right? And he said, do some work that encourages people like us and people who are older than us to be part of the lifeblood of the church. And that's where these sessions came from. So they're not meant to sound like, forgive me, if you're getting on a bit, come to this meeting. It's not meant to be like that. It's much more, what is the pattern of our lives and the expectation and the hope of the church for every generation? Is that all right? So that's where this has come from. Yeah, you don't care really, do you? So look, what I want you to do more than anything in the next few minutes really is I'd like you to relax. We're a family. This is your second home. And, you know, one of the reasons I love being a Catholic is I bring the love of the people of my own parish to this one. So we're part of a community, and I just want you to enjoy the next hour more than anything else. So thank you for the invitation, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for your lovely accents.
For what?
Your accent.
Yeah, I'm very sorry.
Sorry, okay. So, good news from the autumn of life. And just to introduce you, this is my family. There they are. Those of you that came this morning met them briefly through this picture. And that's Alison at the back, she's my wife, and the 3 children there, who Sam is 25, Matthew is 23, he's in the black t-shirt there, and Emily on the top, she's 21. She's just 21. And so you can sort of see where I am in life.
I didn't understand, sorry.
Okay. You can see somehow that what happens is that, you know, you'll know where I am, for those of you who've had children. So my children are leaving home.
Say what?
So we're leaving home. They're leaving home. And so you look at your wife after 20 years of parenting, and she looks at you, and you almost say, who are you? Because something strange happens in our lives, doesn't it? It's sort of life takes over. So that's what we're going to be looking at in a moment. What I ask you to do is to relax, and maybe just briefly, a couple of times during this hour, it's not a gimmick, I'll just ask you to talk to the person next to you, just briefly about what we're doing, all right? So if you don't like the person next to you, there will be an opportunity to move. Thank you. So today's source materials are the exhortations. Pope Francis's 5 exhortations. They have these illustrations in them. I'm going to refer to them from time to time. But of course, if you enjoy this sort of work, keep your eye on what the church is offering to us in these days, because most of what you'll find here is rooted in 2 things. The first is the work of St. John of the Cross, and the second is these exhortations. That's the background of what I'm going to share with you. Now, forgive me, here's a brief piece of Pope Francis, and I don't want you to be alarmed or upset by this, because it's not a criticism. Pope Francis says in his document, The Joy of Love, he says, we need to be humble and realistic, acknowledging that at times the way we present our beliefs and treat each other has helped to contribute to today's problems. We need a healthy dose of self-criticism. Now, please, forgive me, New Zealand, I'm not about to criticise you. All right, I'm a visitor. But it goes a little bit like this. If you go back to St. Augustine, if we had time, I'd love to do this. One of my favourite sessions is on sin. Because often sin was badly taught, not by bad people, it was just not communicated well. For our popes, a good way of looking at sin is not so much that you're a bad person, but that you're unhealthy. It's a better psychology. What it means is the Pope holds up a mirror to the church and he'll say, do you know something? Sometimes we need a healthy dose of realising, if you like, our own illness. It's not that you're a bad person. Another way of looking at it is, this is you not quite at your best. Have you ever said something and then wished you hadn't? No. All right, okay. Well, that's sort of Pope Francis going, you know, sometimes you just take a little look in the mirror and you go, oh, what was I thinking? Are you ready? A good phrase is, I'm better than that. Okay? Now, for Pope Francis, don't be alarmed. He will say at times things like, the church can fall ill. Can fall ill. So let me illustrate that for you. Maybe it's better to look at this. No. Now look, this is me looking in the mirror. All right? And I can pretend that everything is okay. And what Pope Francis does is he isn't going to say the rules need to change. He's not going to say that things aren't working.
Oh, excuse me, I can't hear.
Just come down to the hearing loop at the hearing loop at the back.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry.
No, it's not your fault, sir.
Okay, take your time. Take your time. Let me give you an example. We need a healthy dose of self-deception. So, you know, I can look in the mirror and I can see myself as a lot thinner than I am. All right? Now, interestingly, what Pope Francis will do is he'll say, do you know, sometimes the church can catch a cold. It doesn't mean it's bad, it doesn't mean it's wrong, but let me give you an illustration. For example, the church can lose her joy. Okay? What he means is sometimes we need to reconsider, you know, is everything as it should be? Have you ever, this is not a criticism, have you ever sat in Mass and thought, really? Is this what he meant? Now, don't take this the wrong way. This is not about church teaching. Let me give you an example. In our churches, you know, sometimes back in England, we can lose our joy. And then one day we're at Mass and it's kind of, Alleluia, Alleluia. Now, I know this wouldn't happen in New Zealand. All right? But you ask yourself, did the Lord die for this? We lift up our hearts to the Lord. You know. Now, don't get me wrong. Don't feel hurt by this. What the Pope does, with an element of humour and joy about himself, and Pope Benedict does this in Deus Caritas, he says, you know, just occasionally we need a healthy sense of our self-deception. You know, is this really what he longed for? And are we who we're called to be? So one of the primary homilies, I'm not going to do it today, but we looked at it this morning a bit, One of the primary homilies of Pope Francis, get ready, is cheer up. Nobody is attracted to misery. When did we lose our joy? And don't misinterpret this either. This is not about just clapping at Mass. That's not the energy here. It's saying, are we a joyful people? Do we hold the joy of the gospel in our hearts and then wear it on our faces so that people outside look at us and go, I want what they've got? So the homily becomes, now this is very true for England. I don't know whether it's true for New Zealand. That's not my business. But in England it goes, cheer up and tell your face. You understand? It's not good enough just to cheer up. That's for you. This is the joy of the gospel. The mercy of the gospel is to tell your face. In Amoris Laetitia, a little bit, how about this? Have we got any grandparents here? Oh, God bless grandparents. I love grandparents. Now, in grandparents, now this is for you. In chapter 5 of Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis's document, The Joy of Love, he gives a piece of advice for parents and especially grandparents. And are you ready? It's shockingly simple and deeply profound. And he says, give your children a memory of you smiling. And in their maturity, they will wonder where your joy came from. And you have the beginnings of evangelization. Give your children and your grandchildren a memory of you smiling. Oh, that's what grandparents... Do you know, I love you grandparents. We pray for our grandparents. You make sure you get in front of your grandchildren and you smile at them. They'll think you're weird. Now, we're going to go on a brief spiritual journey now. I hope you'll enjoy it. But I'm going to take you on a little bit of a reflection that may be European. And all I want you to do is to listen to it and ask yourself, is this true of the Bay of Plenty? Is that all right? You know, is this true of us? So, I know this sounds odd, but please be patient with me. It'll make sense in a minute. What do you think was the first thing you ever boasted about? Going back into your early childhood. Now, I've asked a lot of groups this, and I'm not necessarily looking for an answer now, but I'm going to give you the most common answer I've received, which is people look back in their childhood, and especially people who teach small children tell me this, and quite often it's this, your age. So small children meet each other. I'm told this by people who work in nurseries and kindergartens. And small children meet each other and they look at each other, are you ready? And they go, how old are you? And the reply comes, I'm 4. How old are you? And the reply then comes, I'm 4 1/4. And ladies and gentlemen, it's the very beginning of a sad but lifelong discovery that we're going to spend the next 70 or 80 years comparing ourselves. And it begins right from the beginning. It's all in the book of Cain and Abel and all those stories that you thought you were good at things until you met somebody who was better than you. And when you were a small child, you could sing like an angel, you could draw like Picasso, you could think like Einstein, and then you sat next to somebody else and you started comparing yourself. And then you started to discover that you were either better or worse. And it's the beginnings of our insecurities. It doesn't make us a bad people, but it doesn't take long before we start to compare each other's property and things. And I've got an Xbox, or I've got a Samsung. And it doesn't take long before you start to compare your popularity. And this is why young people always date in front of everyone else. you know, and they fall in love and they're kissing each other, and part of you wants to say, not here. And then all I have to do is put my arm around my wife, and my kids go, that's disgusting. You know, but when you're young, you want to advertise, look, everybody, I'm lovable. I'm lovable. He loves me. I love him. You want to declare it to the world. And it doesn't take long before you start to compare your abilities. And before long, you're getting your results and your parents are sticking them in the local paper. And it doesn't take long before you start to compare salaries. And these are not bad things. It doesn't take long before you start to aspire to greater responsibilities. And all these things are fine and laudable and to be enjoyed. And it doesn't become long before, instead of you that you're proud of, it's your children. And then what they do becomes the thing you tell everyone. And in England, we don't see each other for another year. So when it comes to Christmas, we write a little letter and we photocopy it and we stick it in our Christmas cards. And we describe the last year. And we tell everybody how Sally's passed her oboe exam. And we're very proud of her. And then we get one back and somebody else has passed the viola or the violin, and clearly that's harder than an oboe. And it's all very subtle, but we find ourselves caught up into subtle comparisons with our brother or our sister and their children. And it isn't long before it's our illnesses that we're boasting about. Have you? No, come on, church. Have you ever done this? Have you ever made the mistake of saying to somebody, oh, I've got a very bad cold? And you think you're going to get some sympathy, and instead of getting sympathy, they go, oh, I've had a terrible cold, me. And then you realise you're in a competition with who's had the worst cold. You meet people, you say, I've got the flu, and they'll say, oh, it's not the flu. That's not what you've got. The flu is very bad. You've not got the flu. You wouldn't be standing up if you had the flu. You go, look, is this a contest? My mum had a massive heart attack when she was 56. Massive heart attack. They took the veins out of her legs and sewed them around the clogged arteries in her heart. She came within inches of dying. At the end of that, 3 days later, she's holding on to the drip that's sustaining her, and she's taking small steps as though she's never walked before. And coming in the other direction is a man who's had the same operation. And as they passed each other, she told me this story. What do you think his question for her was? Did he say, are you well? How are you? How long is it since you had your operation? Not at all. His question came from this list, and it said, did you have a double or a triple? All right. Did you see this natural inclination to compare ourselves? Now, when my mum said triple, that disappointed him. So instead of saying, well, I only had a double, do you know what he did? He pointed to a man at the end of the ward and said, you see, Jack? He said, quadruple. Imagine waking up in a world one day in which even our health is a contest. And then, ironically, it finishes where it begins. You know, forgive me, it's kind of true, isn't it? You'll meet people and they'll go, I'm 94, you know. And you go, well done. What's your name? They go, oh. No. So you have to understand, you know, life is kind of painful in a way. And it's mirrored with this insatiable desire of the human heart to measure how it's doing against its neighbour. Now, we're going to look at this in the scriptures in a minute, but before we do that, Here's an interesting thing. I was in a parish in a city called Plymouth in England, and this is going to sound morbid, and it wasn't. It was great fun, all right? But we had a congregation just like this, and please don't take this the wrong way. And the theme was, and I wasn't telling them, but we were looking at it spiritually, how to prepare to die. All right? It's not a bad question. It's something we don't discuss in England. There are the two major subjects that matter to us, sex and life, and dying, and we don't talk about them. And you know, the churches were packed for these sessions. It was fascinating. But that wasn't the story. This was the story. I said, look, I have the privilege of going to other places. And do you mind telling me, I asked this group, when you reach your 70s and 80s, what do you boast about? Right? I wanted to know how you compare yourself when you're in the later decades. And this man stood up at the back. It was fantastic. His answer so stunned me, I didn't know what to say. I said, how do you compare yourself? And he looked at me and he said, Dave, all my friends are dead. And I remember thinking, well done, you know. Now, we had great fun with these questions. We had great fun with them. But I just want you to look at the patterns in Mark's Gospel, because these are not trivial, all right? So in the 9th chapter of Mark's Gospel, the disciples are arguing with each other over who is his favourite. All right? They're okay until they start comparing themselves. And by the way, you can read that two ways. One way is this. You can read it as, I'm better than you. And it's tempting to read that way. I don't suspect that's how it worked. I think it worked like this. They were probably looking at each other and going, I think he likes you more than he likes me. As if that even matters. In the 10th chapter of Mark's Gospel, the disciples start protecting Jesus from children, because if children have access to Jesus, what happens to their own status? Do you know, I don't know what it's like here in New Zealand, but in England, 2 millennia after Jesus, we still don't know what to do with our children. You know, a child walks along this aisle and half the church are going, isn't it lovely to have the young families here? And the other half are going, will somebody please control that child? In 10:28, Peter is stressing to Jesus all that he's given up to follow him, hoping that that might be a qualification for deputy headship. In 10:37, James and John want to sit nearest to Jesus in the kingdom. Do you see what's happening here? These are our biblical heroes, and they are comparing themselves and becoming anxious and then becoming insecure. The scripture scholar Raymond Brown once said, why do James and John want to sit either side of Jesus? It's likely, we know that they're brothers. It's likely that there is infighting amongst the disciples. If James and John sit either side of Jesus, what happens to Peter? Now, I know this would never happen here, but in some parishes, people form small groups of what Tom Smales, the Presbyterian priest, once called in his book, holy huddles of the like-minded. Now, if you want, Pope Francis, a little bit of wisdom from Pope Francis, if you want to stay young and open, make sure you have friends who disagree with you. The risk is that you surround with people who would give you the same answer that you'd give. It won't make you a bad person, but it will make you small. Now, I know this wouldn't happen here, but in some parishes, you get cliques. And they're not bad people, but they're people who surround themselves with people who agree with them. And in England, we even divide our parishes into the time you go to Mass. So you'll have people in England say, well, I'm a 9 o'clocker. I'm a 9 o'clock Catholic. Well, me, I'm an 11:30 Catholic. And it's amazing how we form these small groups. Where I come from, do you know what happens? Do you know what happens? People sit in the same pew every Sunday. I know, you'd never do that. But, and do you know, and the amazing thing, you'd say, no, of course we don't save seats at church. I know that. But in England, we're very subtle. So we would never save a seat. Of course we wouldn't. But if somebody was sitting in it, we'd go, oh. In 1041, the others are annoyed with James and John for asking, privately hoping that they wouldn't be relegated to some back seat. But that's not the story. Forgive me. The total of this is here in 1047. The people nearest to Jesus tell Bartimaeus to be quiet. Don't bother the master. Now, why does that matter? Why does that matter? 5 chapters before, Jesus is going to say, before you start worrying about how to be a Catholic, before you start worrying about all the rules, I have come to give sight to the blind. My life, my mission, my Father wants to open the eyes of people who can't see. And out of insecurity and comparison, within 5 chapters, the disciples are turning the blind away. Not bad people, but it is our insecurity and our insatiable desire to compare our performance that is often at odds with our beliefs. And we become insecure and anxious. Now, I'm going to tell you something you know already. Forgive me, don't feel patronised. Are you ready? Your life has a happy ending. And here's another thing. By the power and grace of Almighty God and his Son Jesus Christ, you're going to heaven. Because you know you're not worthy to enter under his roof, but he loves you. And so what Pope Francis is saying is, can I hold up a mirror to the church and say, please, drop all this anxiety, all this worry, all this fear. How am I doing? Am I a failed parent? My children don't go to Mass. What did I do wrong? My grandchildren don't go to Mass. What did I do wrong? And Pope Francis says, put that down. You're a child of God. You're a child of Easter. Your life has a happy ending. Pray for your children. In fact, turns out it's good news about you. And here's another thing. I think God is so gracious. If you pray for your children and you pray for your grandchildren, it's going to be good news for them. Because our God is bigger than our problems. So do you know what Pope Francis says? Cheer up and tell your face. It's not a bad homily, is it? The alternative is this. Now look, please forgive me, I don't know whether this is true, but in England, I'm 57. I'm also 57 in New Zealand. What did I say that? So in England, you know, the thing is, I'm 57. I've had 57 years of being a Catholic by now. An awful lot of the meetings I've been to have been the opposite of this. Now, forgive me, good people, not bad people, but anxious, worried, a bit depressing, miserable, you know, the future of the world, young people today, why don't we do more of this? What are the schools doing? What are those parents doing? What's the church doing? What's Father doing? And before long, it all becomes a bit depressing. And you go, well, what do I want to come to those kind of meetings for? You know, we need to rediscover a new Pentecost. So Pope Benedict said the same thing, and so did St. John Paul II. He said, you know, the future of the church, you don't have to worry about the world. The future of the church depends on her rediscovering her virtue. We're a joyful people. We have a risen Christ. You go into heaven. So forgive me for saying the obvious. That's not the sin of assumption. It's not the sin of presumption. It's faith in Jesus. It's going to be all right, folks. Imagine doing that. Do you know, I've had people tell me I'm not Catholic enough. I've had people tell me I'm too Catholic. I've had both. I've been written about in papers. And after a while, I have to say, Lord, as long as my motives are right and I earnestly seek you, I am going to stop worrying about that stuff. Do you know, my mum, after a heart attack, do you know what she did? She came up to me and she said, David, they were cutting me in half. And she said, but I was praying. And she said, it wasn't an out-of-body experience, but she said, I knew during that operation, I had a message. She said, I didn't hear the Lord speak, but she said, if I was going to live through this, if I was going to survive, I was going to stop worrying about what the world thinks about me. She said, I've spent my whole life worrying about what they think, she said, and I realised on the operating table that I don't even know who they are. Now look, do you know something? At the end of this session, I'm going to challenge you to be the face of the joy to our young people. I want you to, I'm not saying you have ever done this, but we need to be a church of joy for a new generation. And the Lord's going to give you that job. We're going to be the face of welcome to a new generation, but we're not going to get there unless we cheer up and tell our faces. Now here's the thing. Don't do that. Don't do it. Don't do it. It's very seductive. And you'll spend your life competing with each other. And you'll have, you know, kind of various grades of it. Now, Pope Francis puts it like this. We've got just two or three more minutes till a brief break. He talks about, now, if we had time for this, it'd be great to do this. Do a whole day on heresy. Oh, now the church gives, it's fascinating. So the church gives us a history of heresies. And the point of learning about heresy is to say, here are some traps we can fall into. So be careful of them. They're meant to be signposts. Don't make these mistakes. Pope Francis says, avoid two things. And this is in his document, Rejoice and Be Glad. Have you noticed how the Pope's titles of his documents are interesting? The Joy of the Gospel. The Joy of Love. He's written a document called Rejoice and Be Glad. Do you notice a theme? Now he says, avoid Gnosticism and avoid Pelagianism. Now, for those of you who know your theology, you're going to know this, but for those of you who don't, I'm not patronising you. Why would you? Gnosticism is the obsession with knowledge over virtue. So you become a Catholic expert, but you can be rude and unkind. And we've got plenty of them online. Okay? It's where knowledge supersedes the virtues. And you go, hang on a minute, the more you know, the more humble you should be. The second is Pelagianism, where we put all our emphasis on what we do and not on what God does. So it becomes about our actions and not the actions of grace. They're two heresies, which I've described clumsily there. They're better than that. But in Gaudete et Exsultate, Pope Francis says, be careful of focusing on your own part and not on God's grace. So look, if I can paraphrase this, it goes like this. You know, nothing you can do. Are you ready? This is the gospel. Nothing you can do can make God love you more. Did you know that? Do you also know that nothing you can do can make God love you less? Now, if you become preoccupied either with your own achievement or with your own sin, it becomes Pelagian, and you meet people who begin to... Do you know there are people out there who think they're not good enough to come to church? And you go, oh, don't do that. The church is for the broken and the wounded and the foolish. It's not for experts. Now, sorry, don't misinterpret this. We have a team in the diocese and we have courses available to help us to grow in faith, but not grow in pride, not grow in arrogance, not grow in superiority. Look, I love this. Gnosticism. When somebody has an answer for every question, it's a sure sign they're on the wrong path. That's Pope Francis. He's not being liberal with words there. He's saying, beware of people. Have you ever met somebody who, no matter what you say, they'll tell you what the answer is? And part of you wants to go, look, will you just listen to my pain? My wife's always saying that. She says, don't answer. She just says to me, don't answer, David. I would just need you to listen. All right? Because I'm hurting. I don't need you to come up with a brief summary of my problem and then give me 3 solutions to it. I need you to live with it with me. It's what your bishop calls accompaniment. You know, hearts burning within us. We've got to walk this together. It's going to hurt. Last thing I need is an expert. So look, here's the problem. All right? And it's not a church problem. It's a cultural problem. And it's basically this. As soon as we start comparing ourselves, we either become over-anxious or over-indulgent in our own position. Mother Teresa once put it like this. Blessed Mother Teresa once put it, you've heard this before, your life isn't about you anyway. That's a great line. Your life's not about you. I wish I'd learnt that younger. Spent too much time worrying about how I'm doing and not enough time enjoying God's grace. I shared with them this morning, supposing you get to heaven and God says to you, you get to the gates of heaven and God says to you, before you come in, do you mind filling in an evaluation? And then there's only one question in the evaluation and it says, did you enjoy it? The life I gave you? And part of me will go, were we supposed to? Now look, I know you weren't probably expecting this, but a brief reference to the Spice Girls. Do you remember the Spice Girls? Did they make it big in New Zealand? Can anybody name all 5? No. That's great. Don't even try. Don't even try. See the woman on the right hand at the end? She was called Ginger Spice. Her name's Geri Halliwell. And Geri Halliwell did a great thing, you know. She said, I'd spent my whole life comparing myself. She said, on the 7th of November 1996, they hoisted me up in a crane above Oxford Street in central London, and my job was to turn on the Christmas lights. She says, at this moment in my life, I had 10,000 people chanting my name. She said, I'd spent my whole life believing that this was what my life was for. I had people chanting my name. I was a millionaire. I was successful and I was adored. And she says, as I put those Christmas tree lights on, I found a hole in my heart and I discovered that none of this was going to work. I'd compared myself to others and won. I was the top of the tree. I was successful, famous and popular, and deeply, deeply empty. How many gardeners do you know take photographs of themselves? The answer is they don't. They take pictures of their gardens. All right? Now the problem is we have several generations now, not just the young people, who are damaged by the idea of selfies. And I mean as a metaphor, that my life is all about me. I've just spent the last week looking at your beautiful country, and it is blessed with beauty, all right? But I'm amazed at how many people are taking pictures of themselves. And you go, look, I know you want to be remembered, and I know you want to remember yourself as being there, but actually take a picture of the mountain. Archbishop Vincent Nichols, this is lovely. Sorry, I'll just blind it for a second. This is a letter from Pope Francis. Archbishop Vincent Nichols is about to be made a cardinal. This was years ago, and he shared this letter with me. I was very grateful for the letter, and in it, this is what struck me. This is Pope Francis writing to a new cardinal, and he said, the cardinalate is not a promotion, an honour, or an award. It is simply a service which calls for a broader vision and a bigger heart. You are not to compare yourselves with anyone. Okay, now we're halfway through the session, just over. With the person next to you, I just want you to greet them, which is a bit weird if you're married. And then, just for a few minutes, all I want you to do is just say to each other, "He's right, you know." He's right. Or you might say to the person next to you, "This isn't what I was expecting at all. This isn't what I was expecting." Or you might say to the person next to you, "It's a bit annoying because this isn't what I want. This is not helpful. I want you to be adults. And I just want you just for a couple of minutes to say, yeah, I quite like this. And what he reminds me of, or the thing that struck me was, or just I still don't know what this is about." Because the second half is going to make more sense than the first. We've only got about 25 minutes to go. Just for a couple of minutes, warm each other up, okay? Just speak to each other. Now, here's something that the last 25 minutes of today is a gift that I believe you can give to the church. And it's all to do with your feet, strangely. Just bear with me a second. When I first started teaching, I started my teaching career. I taught mainly 14 to 18-year-olds back in the mid-80s. And I was promoted fairly quickly. I was very grateful. I was very fortunate. I was very blessed. I found myself as a deputy head in a large Catholic high school in the East Midlands of England, a mining town where there were no Catholics and no mines. And I'm glad you get the irony, right? But I remember being in an office. We had a boy we had a lot of problems with, and he kept, there is a point at which you have to say, if you can't do this, you are not safe here. And he was a really tricky character. And we decided he brought a knife into school. He never used it, but that was enough to make him dangerous. And so we said to him, "You've got one more chance." His mother pleaded with us not to expel him from the school. And we gave him one more chance, all right? And on this last occasion, we decided just to make it that bit more serious, we contacted the local police and said, "Look, I know this sounds cruel, but will you just come and maybe explain to this boy why this is so serious?" Now, this policeman took it very seriously, and he gave this lad a bit of a telling off, and there was me and the head teacher and the policeman and the boy's mother and him. And it was quite ferocious, really. We were trying to save him from himself, right? It was done with love. But at the end, this policeman added something. It took me a bit by surprise. I didn't know he was going to do this. He finished by saying, "And by the way, take a pride in yourself. Take a pride in your appearance." He said, "Look at my shoes," this policeman said. And sure enough, he looked down and they were so polished and so perfect. You could almost see your face in them. And then he pointed at the head teacher, our school principal, and said, "Look at Mr. Murphy's shoes." And sure enough, they were pristine. And then he said, "And look at Mr. Wells's." And then he stopped because he realised that my shoes weren't the condition of his. But it goes a little bit like this. And this is important for us in the spiritual life. It goes, there's a real tradition about taking off your shoes. Now, what is this going to be? And it's something to do with our lives and our spiritual lives. You notice that we have this notion that holy ground, right, take off your shoes, take off your comparisons, take off all the performance and all the qualifications and all the success and all the things that you've built around your own Tower of Babel, and take off your shoes, because what you're about to meet is bigger than you. Now, forgive me, I'm going to suggest that this is going to make total sense to you in a way that it won't to your grandchildren. And so this next bit I don't teach to children, not because they couldn't understand it, but because they're not ready for it. All right, 20 minutes to go. What is taking off your shoes all about? Well, we have this breathtaking scene in John's Gospel, don't we? The Mass of the Last Supper. Now, in our parish, I remember saying to my parish priest, Father, now he's a priest in his late 60s, and I said, Father, in all the years that you've been washing feet on Maunday Thursday, the Mass of the Last Supper, have you ever washed a pair of dirty feet? And my priest looked at me and he said, no. And I said, so does that mean, Father, that when you ask people to come forward to have their feet washed, that they're not dirty? And he said, yes, that's true. I said, so do you suspect that they wash their feet before they come to Mass? And he said, well, David, I ring them up and I say, are you coming to the Mass of the Last Supper? And the person says, yes, Father, I am. And they say, well, do you mind if you come forward to have your feet washed? And he said, I suspect in getting that phone call, there isn't a person that doesn't wash their feet before they come to Mass. Now, can I just say something to you? That completely undermines the point of the exercise. Do you know, I live in a culture back in England where we so compare ourselves that the idea of having dirty feet at the Mass of the Last Supper is unbearable. We would rather wash feet than have our feet washed. And can I just say that again? We would rather wash feet than have our feet washed. It's such a powerful image of servitude that we can barely cope with it. And so he and I, we had some fun. He's a friend of mine. And he said, you know, Dave, I think you're right. I think next year, he said, I'm not going to ring anybody up. I'll just wash feet randomly. Do you know what happened that year? This was 2 years ago. Do you know what happened? Instead of 12 people washing their feet, 250 people washed their feet. In case they got chosen. But I remember very powerfully, very, very powerfully, Father and the altar server and the deacon walking down the church, and you could feel who's going to get their feet washed. But that wasn't the story. The best bit was my wife, who just leant over to me and said, Dave, I hope he asks somebody with tights. Just a minute, Van. Look, there is a reason for this. So he came to Simon Peter and he said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? And Jesus answered, you do not know what I'm doing, but later you'll understand. And Peter said to him, you'll never wash my feet. And Jesus answered, unless I wash your feet, unless you come to me dirty, unless you come to me as you are, you have no share with me. Now stop comparing yourself, Peter. Take off your shoes, for the ground you stand on is holy, and it's nothing to do with you. The first temptation in the Christian life is to judge yourself by what you accomplish. You know, when Jesus was challenged to turn stone into bread, do you know the breathtaking challenge there is that the devil's subtly saying to Jesus, you could solve the world's poverty with one action. turn stone into bread, and there will be no poor. And Jesus knows, on behalf of our humanity, that this is the beginning of our realization that we turn in upon ourselves and it becomes about what we do. But then we have a second temptation, don't we? Peter's second problem: Lord, not my feet then. If this is what it's about, don't just wash my feet, but my hands and my head. Now, what's that about? The interesting thing is, once you begin to discover that what you're meant to do is stop fighting yourself and take your shoes off, the next thing is you can kind of fall into another version of this, which is to put faith in your own performance. In other words, if washing is our get into heaven, give me a shower. Do you see how subtle this it is? But it's still about me, and it's still about how I'm doing. And these two things are preventing Jesus from ministering to Peter. Now, forgive me. Do you know something? It's a central tenet of the Pope's most recent exhortation, and it goes like this. Do you know what holiness is? Holiness is you being yourself. It's a definition in Catholic doctrine. Holiness is you being who God created you to be. Not a comparison. Not more like the person sitting next to you. Not more like David Wells. And not more like Father. Father's challenge is to be fully himself. Your challenge is to be fully yourself. Otherwise, you deprive the world of God's unique creation in you. And to do that, all the Lord says is, take off your shoes and stop trying. Now, if you really enjoy this, you'll probably find its roots in St. John of the Cross, the dark night of the soul, in which he describes our lives roughly into 3 phases. All right, don't take it too seriously, but he's a saint of the church. He describes the journey of our life as if it was one night time. It begins as the night of the senses, it becomes proficiency, and then it becomes the dark night of the spirit. Now look, for those of you who enjoy your spiritual writers, you'll recognise that. But I'm now going to give you an earthed example in the hope that it makes some sense. Is that all right? It's not super complicated, but I think it's quite beautiful. And it works like this. The Greeks have 3 words for power. Now, you know the Greeks have 4 words for love. All right? So they have the sort of a word for love when we apply it to somebody we fall in love with. They have another word for love when it's applied to our parents. And they have another word for love when we say we love chocolate. All right? But in English, we only have one word. So we use I love my wife the same as we say I love my mother. Actually, they're different things. And I love chocolate, or I love nice weather. All right? Now, the Greeks have 3 words for power, and you might recognise 2 of them. The first word, dynamis, is where we get dynamite from. Now, as the biblical metaphor in St. John of the Cross, this works quite simply. It's you in your youth, bungee jumping. All right, dynamis is you falling in love, or choosing a career, or doing something crazy. Just go back to being 16 and you'll understand dynamis. Dynamis is all about the adventure of life. It's about moving away. It's about broadening your horizons. It's about challenging yourself. See, my 2 eldest sons at the moment are into parachuting. And I say, don't do that, you'll die. And they look at me and they say, we won't, Dad. Because they're 20... You understand this, don't you? They think they're invincible. You know, when you're 21, you don't believe harm can come to you. Now, that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. That's why we don't do this session with children. Understand? Because when you're a kid, it's all about dynamite. I spent 20 years of my life working with young people. It's all sexual chemistry. You walk into a room with young people and there's so much energy in the room, it's scary. That's a good thing. Then there's energia, from where we get the word energy. And in St. John of the Cross, this is you setting your face like flint to Jerusalem. Another way of putting it is, it's you paying your mortgage. It's the energy that makes you get up and go to work on a Monday morning. It's a different kind of stamina. All right? You've all done it. You pay your bills. You do your responsibilities and you grow up. And you can't have dynamite all the time anymore because you've got children. All right? This is you getting up in the middle of the night because your daughter's teething. All right? This is you putting the bottle of wine down and picking up the mantle of responsibility. This is you growing up, and it hurts. And then there's a third word for power, and it's in the Gospels, but it's less known in the English. And it's this. It's the power of what the Greeks call exousia. And it means the power of a baby, or the power of vulnerability. One of the reasons I'm a Christian is because it's the only religion that came to us as a baby. Jesus comes to us in exousia, vulnerable. There's no dynamite. There's no stamina. There's just a baby. Now, do you know something? This might be true. I don't know. Maybe it's up there, upstairs. But if we brought a baby into this church right now that was asleep, do you know that it would have power? It's a kind of vulnerable power. Like, okay, I worked on a building site one summer, and a woman came in with a child into the canteen where we were eating, and it was all men, and they were all swearing, and it was kind of quite earthy, all right, and quite rude and quite vulgar. And this child and its mother came into the room, and the men started whispering. Because the baby had power. It had vulnerable power. All right? Now I'm going to... Look, this is not a riddle. Here's my dad. It's 1952, and he's about to jump out of that airplane. He's not in the picture. He's taking the picture. He's in the parachute regiment, and this is over Egypt. All right? Shortly before he died, he went back there in his mind. And I remember him saying to me, shortly before he died, Dave, I'm going to make one more jump, and they're not going to give me a parachute. It's not a bad definition of faith, that. He was actually genuine. He was a man of great faith. But shortly before he died, he was scared. Like we all will be. Here he is in his energia years, paying the bills, putting the food on the table and bringing me and my brother and sister up. He's a young man growing into middle age, taking his responsibilities seriously and growing up. Energia, the power of stamina. And here he is, the third stage of the dark night of the soul, shortly before he died. And do you understand when you look at him there? He has no dynamite, he has no energy, he only has exousia, and it's very, very powerful. When he speaks, his grandchildren shut up. Not out of fear, not out of respect, but out of exousia. Because Grandad's going to say something. And he might tell them a story he's told them before, and he might tell them several times. But he has a different power now, and it's the power of exousia. It's the power of being vulnerable. In the scriptures, it's to be broken. Now, forgive me. It works a little bit like this. The scripture scholar Ronald Rolheiser draws attention to this in his book on the Passion. And it goes a little bit like this. If you read John's Gospel, the moment Jesus is arrested, from then on, the Greek origin of Jesus' authority is always the word exousia. the power of vulnerability. He gives himself. Now we're coming into a deep spiritual truth now, and I just want you to pray about it in the future. Your very weakness, your very vulnerability, the strength that you once had that you no longer hold, is not to be grieved, because you have a new power, the power of exousia, the power of surrender. Do you know what you're about to do in the next 20 years? Is you're going to give in. And you're going to let God be God. And you're going to smile the face of joy. And you're going to become exousia. And you know something? You can give the joy of Christ to the next generations by making one simple prayer. I've prayed about this, and I hope these are the last words. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I already know what I want the last words to come out my mouth to be. Sorry, I want to lie. I don't know how I'm going to die, do I? But I hope it goes like this. I want my last prayer to be, thy will be done. I give in. It's you. I'm powerless now. And I give it to you. You do your thing. I've spent my whole life trying to prove myself, to be something, to be somebody, to be popular, to be successful, to be wealthy. I'll give in. Lord, take me as I am. I hope that I die with no shoes on my feet. Now, look, I'm saying to your church, our young people desperately need you. Just to be that face of exousia. To look into the eyes of young people and don't judge them. Don't assess them. Don't ask them why they're not coming to Mass. Just be the face of Christ. Just look into their eyes and say, you know, you are lovable. God loves you. He always did. He always will. And when you're ready, the doors of my heart and this church are open. So if any of you come today worrying about your children or worrying about your grandchildren or worrying about the future, I ask you, give in. Pray the prayer, the Lord's Prayer. Lord, thy will be done. You know, he's won. We don't have to worry about it. It's going to be all right. There's no other way to understand Christianity than by the power of vulnerability. David Wells, I've got to stop fighting and give in. That's the spirituality of St. John of the Cross. Give in. Give in. Dave, I've got one more jump to make, and they're not giving me a parachute. Now, I am nearly finished. Can we do just 5 minutes more? Do you mind? I know you've done over an hour now. I love this passage in John's Gospel. Exousia is all the way through it. These are the disciples of John the Baptist. You need to know that. And they're a bit jealous. They're a bit jealous. And do you know who they're jealous of? Jesus. Look at this. It says, these are the disciples of John the Baptist speaking. And they say, the one who was across the Jordan to whom you testified. Here he is, baptizing, and they're all going to him. Do you realise that the people who followed John the Baptist were annoyed with Jesus? Do you know that? Because all the crowds, you see, exousia, it wasn't. It was dynamis. And they were loving it because 10,000 people a day were coming to be baptised and they were so successful. And then Jesus turns up and everybody heads off in that direction. Has that ever happened to you? Where you were centre of attention and then somebody else comes in and ruins the party? And these poor men are standing there going, but we've lost our jobs. They're all going after Jesus. And what does John the Baptist say? He says, exousia, exousia, exousia. Or put another way, my joy has been fulfilled. He must increase. I must decrease. It's the journey of the wisdom of the church. And forgive me, it needs you. It needs you to be that face of powerlessness and joy for a world that's looking for a smile before it looks for a message. Somebody said to me recently, you know, my children, they're not going to church. And I said, I know, it hurts. It does hurt. I know that pain. But they said to me, you know, the thing is, what should I do? And I said, love them. Don't fall out with them. Love them. Keep the door open. Be the Father in Luke chapter 15. Don't close the door. Be exousia. Be vulnerable. Say to the Lord, thy will be done, even in the lives of my children. And keep that door open. Pope Francis said in Lithuania last year, we must be a church on the move, unafraid to go out and get involved, even when it might seem that we pour ourselves out and lose ourselves in going forth to the weak, the neglected, those dwellings on the margins of life. Holiness does not make you less human, since it's an encounter between your weakness and the power of God's strength. That's Pope Francis defining holiness for us. It's not about you being good. Those things are a consequence of it. Holiness is you taking off your shoes before the Lord and saying, thy will be done in my life, in the life of the people I love, and in my community. And then being that face to others. Now, I know you knew all this, but I want you to feel valuable, precious. You don't have to be 21, you know. You don't have to be 21. What you have to be is you. And the little you can do can change people. Now, St. Francis de Sales, now look, please stay where you are. Francis de Sales, patron saint of teachers, he said, more flies are attracted to a spoonful of honey than a barrel full of vinegar. Now, what does that mean? It means this. You're going to get in your cars in a minute, and you're going to drive away, and this time tomorrow, you're going to forget everything. That's the barrel full of vinegar. But what did you hear this afternoon, or feel, or think, or share with each other that's turned into a spoonful of honey? Have you heard something, or thought something, or felt something, and you say to yourself, I want to remember that? All right? It only has to be one thing, your spoonful of honey, not the barrel full of vinegar. Now, forgive me, just bear with me a second. It might not be anything I said. It's a thought you had, or a quote you read, or a feeling. You go, I want to hold on to the spoonful of honey. I'm going to forget the whole talk, but I need to remember that one thing. Now, forgive me, very briefly, just for 2 minutes, would you tell the person next to you, has there been any honey here? And feel free to say, well, not really. All right? But if there has, share it with the person next to you. Okay. A tiny vignette to finish. Please keep that conversation going on in the car. All right? A tiny vignette to finish. I had the privilege just a short while ago, a few years ago, of working in northern Nigeria in a city called Jos. And for 2 days, I went up into a mountain village, miles from anywhere. I was the first white person to walk into that village for 20 years. I was an ambassador for a charity, and I was going there to learn about their way of life. On the first day, they gave me a bucket of water, and they said you can drink in it, wash in it, or wash your ablutions away with it, but when it's gone, it's gone. Suddenly made me very appreciative of a world of taps. All right? Wow, that was a good lesson in itself, but that isn't the story. This is the story. They asked me to give a talk, and I stood in front of 40 men. It was a talk to their pastoral council in the parish. And in this pastoral council, in this parish, in the middle of the mountains, miles from anywhere, the pastoral council were all men. And they sat dutifully listening while I gave a talk. Now, anybody who's ever led a group will know what this is like. Have you ever led something and it's not working? It's the most terrible feeling. You know it's not working. You've been very gracious to me this afternoon, but sometimes you're talking to a group and they're all staring at the floor and your mouth's dry and your hands are sweating and it's just embarrassing. And it was awful. And at the end, Father thanked me and asked the men to give me a round of applause, which they all did. And then he said, "Are there any questions?" And of course there weren't any, because it hadn't worked. And then Father pointed at one of the men and said, "You, ask a question." And this man stood up to attention and asked a question. And it was all painful and embarrassing, but these were good people. And that night, they invited me to a banquet. These are poor people. And because I was from the West, they thought, out of their dignity and respect for me, that I should have a menu. So they wrote a menu in the best English they could come up with. And the only word I recognised on the menu was the word soup. So thinking that that was fairly safe and that my stomach was fragile, I said, "I'll try the soup, please." And they were delighted and they went off, and about 20 minutes later, they brought in the soup to a round of applause. And they put it in front of me, and ladies and gentlemen, it was effectively a bowl of tepid, warm water with a selection of organs floating in it. Now look, forgive me, we all have our cultural tastes, right? And you know and I know that out of respect for these people, my job was to eat that soup. And I was going to eat it because it was everything they had. And so there was this sort of organ, I think it was a heart, floating in the water. And I got my fork and I stabbed it. And it went... It was almost like the last wish of this chicken is I'm going to spit at the person who tries to eat me. And then I did what I did when I was a child, when my mum asked me to eat things I didn't like. I put that organ into my mouth and chewed it aggressively. And I was forcing it down my gullet, and my stomach was going, "Not down here, you're not." And it was like my stomach was fighting my mouth. And, you know, part of me was reaching and the other part of me was going, "Get it down there, get it down there." And I finished that soup. And I finished that soup. And I was determined to finish that soup. The next day, I get in the minibus that drives up to the village to pick me up. And the priest walks down to the minibus with me. And he took my hand and he shook my hand and he said, "David, you're a true missionary." And I said, "Father, that talk was dreadful. We both know it was awful, and I apologise. I apologise that I didn't know your people better. I apologise that I didn't know them before I spoke to them, and I'm sorry." And he looked at me a bit puzzled, and then he said, "David, the talk was dreadful." He said, "I'm not talking about the talk." He said, "You ate the soup. You ate the soup. Now look, forgive me. Forgive me." Sometimes we imagine it's what we do that makes us, but in the Gospels it's who we are. And I ask you this afternoon, God still has a virtue that he wants you to give away. I ask you to pray for patience, to pray for tenderness, to pray for the virtues that come with exousia. I ask you to pray for young people and be gentle with them. I ask you not to judge them or to ask them to be like you. I ask you rather to take off your shoes before him who gave his life for us and commit to being the smile of the church to a hungry world and discover the joy of eating the soup. Can I thank you for coming today. Thank you for thinking of these things. Thank you for praying about these things. And whatever happens, don't give up, give in. All right? Thank you for blessing me with your attention and your courtesy and your love. May God bless you. Have a wonderful life. And if I don't see you again, I'll see you in the next one. Amen.